I spent last Sunday driving through a suburban neighborhood in Texas that, on the surface, looked like the American dream. Impeccable lawns, quiet streets, rows of those classic single-family homes. But as I kept driving, I noticed something unsettling. Every third or fourth house had a lockbox on the door or a for rent sign with some corporate logo I didn't recognize. No tricycles in the driveways, no curtains in the windows, just a row of dark, empty living rooms. I ended up chatting with a guy, Mike, who lived on the corner. He's been there for 30 years, and he was pointing at this house across the street that had been vacant for 6 months. That's owned by an investment group out of California, he told me, leaning against his fence. They bought it sight unseen, way over what any local family could afford, and now it just sits there. And he seemed almost proud, proud of the value of his neighborhood, bragging about how high the prices had climbed. To him, the fact that a giant entity wanted his street was a badge of honor. It was proof his biggest asset was, well, gold. But then the conversation shifted. I mentioned a news report I had seen that morning about the local shelter being at double capacity, with families living in cars just 3 miles away in the city center. The change in Mike was whole. It was instant. His face just tightened, and he started venting about eyesores and how the city was falling apart because of the homeless problem. He called it a tragedy, a drain on the system, and wondered why the government couldn't just, fix it. He didn't seem to see the irony at all. He was celebrating the fact that 33% of the homes sold last year went to investors who often keep them empty or turn them into high-priced rentals, while at the same time cursing the reality of people who can no longer afford a roof. It's this bizarre, modern doublethink. We cheer when housing becomes an unreachable gold mine, yet we're shocked when the people who used to live in those houses end up on the sidewalk. Right now, there are roughly 19 vacant homes for every one homeless person in America. It's a gap that feels less like a market fluctuation and more like a historical echo. Because whether it's the sprawling estates of ancient Rome or the empty investment properties of 2025, history shows us that when the places where people live become nothing more than chips in a high-stakes game for the few, the foundation of everything else begins to crack.
That anecdote just ends. It perfectly encapsulates the core conflict of our current moment.
Well,
We've managed to redefine housing, shifting it from a fundamental requirement for stability to a vehicle for concentrated capital, a gold mine, like your neighbor said. And the social cost is this devastating and accelerating rise in homelessness and unaffordability. We have a profound structural problem where the celebration of housing as an unreachable asset, which provides spectacular yield to investors, is directly juxtaposed with the social cost borne by the most vulnerable. They're just displaced entirely from the market.
right, and that's the puzzle we need to solve here. We have some stark data, and the story of Mike's neighborhood is definitely not an isolated incident. So our mission in this deep dive is to really understand that complex, often counterintuitive relationship. How does this wave of residential investment combine with these structural supply constraints and those huge national vacancy rates? How does it all intersect to create this modern crisis of affordability and displacement?
Exactly. And we have to move past the simple, often repeated narratives. For example, the idea that the crisis is caused exclusively by massive Wall Street firms. We need to identify who is truly driving this purchasing frenzy and what that concentration of ownership ultimately means for the average person who's just trying to achieve a stable life.
Okay, so let's start with the sheer scale of this investment frenzy because the numbers are, frankly, alarming. If you look at the data for the second quarter of 2025, investors purchased a staggering 33% of all single-family residential properties sold. That is the highest percentage we've seen in 5 years. It's a huge jump from 25.7% just the year before.
It is. That 33% figure is undeniably stark, but we do need to put it into the proper context just to avoid any misinterpretation. While the percentage of sales going to investors spiked to that 5-year high, the actual raw number of homes they purchased during that quarter was about 16,000 fewer than the year before.
Oh, interesting. So what does that mean?
It means the high percentage primarily reflects a weak overall home sales market. The total volume of transactions was low, so it's not so much an absolute surge in investor buying. However, and this is the key point, the concentration of capital targeting the available inventory is absolutely undeniable. That's the systemic problem we're focusing on.
So the pie got smaller, but investors took a much, much bigger slice. And when we talk about who these investors are, the media narrative often points fingers exclusively at these giant private equity funds. You hear names like BlackRock thrown around, creating this single giant villain. But if we actually dig into the data, the true investor profile is far more nuanced, isn't it?
It's fascinating, really. The large institutional funds are often the boogeyman in the public imagination. but they account for a very, very small fraction of investor-owned properties. The dominant force, the true modern engine of this displacement, is actually the small investor. These are defined as people or entities owning between 1 and 5 properties. This group holds a staggering 87% of all investor-owned single-family homes.
87%. So the squeeze isn't primarily caused by a dozen massive companies, but by millions of smaller, decentralized wealth-building vehicles. We're talking about individuals, families, small LLCs, all looking for yield in housing. That's a pervasive force that's much harder to regulate or even identify.
It is precisely that. And if you include the mid-size investors, those holding between 6 and 10 properties, that covers another 4% of the market. And its decentralized ownership structure has been fundamentally enabled by technology. Small investors today can use incredibly sophisticated tools. Think about advanced data mining from platforms like Zillow and Redfin, which lets them identify high-yield properties remotely. They use platforms for remote property management, algorithmic rent pricing. They can function with an efficiency that used to be reserved only for the big institutional players.
And where does the money come from? It's not like they all have millions in cash sitting around.
A lot of it comes from mechanisms like home equity lines of credit, ELCs, against their primary residence, or they pool funds into small LLCs with friends and family. It enables this decentralized capital to act with the speed and reach of a monolithic entity.
And to really underscore how counterintuitive this all is, the largest institutional funds, the ones that own 1,000 or more properties, they only account for a tiny 2% of investor-owned homes. And there was a detail we saw that really undercuts the conventional wisdom about them.
Yes. In fact, these largest institutional investors were net sellers in the 6 consecutive quarters leading up to Q2 2025.
Wow, net sellers.
It shows that the market squeeze and the concentration we're analyzing are overwhelmingly being driven by this massive decentralized pool of smaller capital that's just chasing yield. They're profit maximizers, and right now the highest yield for this group is found in single-family residential homes.
And that yield chasing has a distinct geographic bias, right? It's not happening everywhere equally. It targets areas with high population growth and what's perceived as economic stability. We see the raw numbers of investor-owned homes concentrated heavily in these major growth states. Texas leads by a lot with 1.46 million investor-owned homes, then California with 1.33 million, and Florida with 1.1 million. But what makes this so disruptive is what they are buying.
The focus on starter homes. That's the strategic element that makes this so deeply disruptive to the middle class. In Q2 2025, investors paid an average purchase price of $455,481 per home. That figure is substantially below the overall market average of $512,800. They are explicitly targeting the bottom third of the housing price distribution, the precise market segment we define as starter homes, or the properties that offer the highest rental cash flow yield for an investor.
Let's connect this to the real consequences for potential homeowners. I saw a story recently that just heartbreakingly illustrates this dynamic. It's about a couple, Marcus and Elena, in Riverside, California. They really represent this missing middle, a hardworking pair who had saved for 6 years to afford a modest starter home. But every single time they placed an offer on a house, they were consistently outbid by these anonymous LLCs making all-cash offers within hours of the listing.
It's an impossible situation.
It gets worse. One specific 3-bedroom house they loved sat empty for months after being purchased by an LLC, only to reappear on a rental app at a price significantly higher than a conventional mortgage payment would have been. Tragically, when Marcus's hours were cut at work, the lack of stable, affordable housing meant they couldn't find a cheaper place to downsize quickly enough. They eventually ended up living in their SUV, parked just blocks away from the empty houses they had tried to buy.
And that story shows the stark reality of the tactical advantage that investors have. When they look for yield, they can bypass all the typical risks that individual buyers relying on mortgages face. When an investor makes an offer, it's often all cash. That means the seller doesn't have to worry about the financing falling through, which is a massive concern in the current rate environment. Furthermore, investors are willing to accept homes in as-is condition.
So they eliminate financing risk, they eliminate appraisal worries, and they sidestep any demands for pre-closing repairs or concessions that an individual buyer would typically negotiate. For a seller, especially an older person or someone who needs a quick close, that investor cash offer isn't just about the price. It's about certainty and speed.
It creates an irresistible fast lane that systematically shuts out the first-time buyer. If you're a family relying on a conventional mortgage that requires an appraisal to match the loan value, and you need time for inspections and repairs, you simply cannot compete with that speed and certainty. The result is the systemic depletion of inventory that Marcus and Elena experienced.
And that leads directly to the vicious cycle that affects everyone, even people who don't want to buy a house. When fewer people are able to purchase a starter home, they're forced to remain in the rental market. This increased demand for rentals subsequently drives up rent prices across the board, intensifying the squeeze at the lower end of the market and increasing the risk of displacement for millions.
And the affordability barrier is now just incredibly high. Bankrate reports that 42% of aspiring homeowners already state they cannot afford a down payment or closing costs. But the financial reality for the average American is now completely inverted. Across the country, it is actually cheaper to rent than to purchase a home in all 50 of the top U.S. metro areas. This means housing, historically the primary vehicle for building American middle-class wealth, has become functionally inaccessible for those who need it most.
And when you combine that erosion of starter home inventory with the crippling costs of entry, you see exactly why the homelessness crisis is accelerating so violently. Homelessness rose by 18% in a single year to an all-time high of about 771,400 individuals in 2024. That translates to 23 people experiencing homelessness for every 10,000 Americans, which places the U.S. among the worst developed nations for housing stability.
And we're seeing that disproportionately affect the most vulnerable members of society.
Okay.
The share of children under the age of 18 experiencing homelessness increased by a stunning 33% between 2023 and 2024. That's the largest jump of any age group, and it demonstrates that displacement is increasingly a family tragedy.
Okay, that brings us to the statistic that causes perhaps the most visceral anger and frustration in this entire debate. We have nearly 15 million vacant homes across the country against roughly 771,400 homeless individuals. That jarring arithmetic gives us approximately 19 vacant homes for every one homeless person in America. It feels like an abundance in a time of famine. So why can't we simply put people in those 15 million empty houses?
That 19-to-1 ratio is powerful, and it drives the demand for simple, immediate solutions. However, the first step in understanding this paradox is to introduce a key distinction. Not all vacancies are created equal. And the issue is fundamentally characterized by what researchers call a cruel geographic mismatch. The vast majority of those 15 million properties are usually not where the homeless population needs housing, nor are they generally suitable for immediate habitation.
So when we see that massive number, what are we missing about how the Census Bureau actually classifies a vacant home? Because the common assumption is that these are all ready to move in, deliberately withheld apartments in high-cost cities.
Right, and that assumption is incorrect. We have to deconstruct the Census Bureau's classifications. The largest single category of vacant housing by far is seasonal, recreational, or occasional use. We're talking about over 4.3 million units that fall into this bucket. Everything from mountain ski chalets, beach houses, timeshares, to hunting cabins.
That's nearly a third of the total 15 million. And they are concentrated in places that are completely disconnected from the job centers, transportation networks, and social service safety nets that homeless populations need.
Absolutely. Think about where these units are concentrated. The coastal regions of Florida and New Jersey, ski areas in Colorado, remote rural counties. For example, Maine has the highest overall vacancy rate in the country at 21.09%, followed by Vermont at 20.06%. While those numbers sound high, these regions often lack the employment opportunities and the public infrastructure necessary to support the large, complex homeless populations we find in major metros like New York or LA. Simply trying to convert a summer cottage in a county with a median age of 60 into permanent housing for a newly displaced family just doesn't solve their underlying needs for employment, education, and social support.
Okay, so that accounts for the largest chunk of the available vacant housing. But what about the high-cost, high-homelessness cities like Los Angeles or New York? Surely they are sitting on hundreds of thousands of empty properties.
In those high-demand markets, we have to look at another key census category: market churn. Even in perpetually hot and undersupplied markets, some vacancies are essential frictions of a functioning market. For the LA metro area, over 50% of the vacant homes recorded are simply units that are between residents. They might be waiting for the lease to start, undergoing standard deep cleaning, or transitioning ownership. Another 10% or so are locked up because they are undergoing necessary repairs or renovations to meet code or new tenant expectations.
So if we legislated a policy to force all of those units to be occupied immediately, we would actually grind the rental market to a halt. We'd eliminate the time needed for cleaning, for maintenance, and that necessary transition period between one tenant moving out and the next one moving in.
It would be disastrous and illogical. Economists note that just as there is a natural, healthy rate of unemployment in the labor market, there is a natural rate of vacancy in the housing market. It allows people to move and ensures properties are maintained. In fact, many high-cost cities like Portland, Oregon, or Washington, D.C. actually have exceptionally low vacancy rates, often below 3%. This scarcity is precisely why their rents are so high. There are too few openings, which increases competition exponentially.
Then you have the third major category, the zombie properties, which are vacant homes in struggling areas, often the consequence of structural economic decline, not investment speculation.
These are found predominantly in low-demand, shrinking cities, often in the Rust Belt. In cities like Baltimore or Detroit, the vacancy problem is one of structural decay and abandonment. Detroit, at its low point, faced nearly 100,000 vacant houses. The city's land bank has had to demolish over 27,000 unsafe structures just to stabilize neighborhoods and prevent these decaying houses from damaging adjacent habitable properties.
And the cost to take one of those Detroit or Baltimore properties, which might be structurally unsound, lack updated plumbing and electrical, and sit in a neighborhood with failing public services, and convert it into safe, habitable housing for a homeless family from a high-demand area is just monumental.
The rehabilitation costs often far exceed the market value of the home, assuming there's even local demand for housing there in the first place. This is why the narrative that 15 million vacant homes should easily solve the crisis is so misleading. There is no federal incentive, and certainly no local funding, to convert a crumbling rural shack or a shuttered seasonal luxury condo into a viable urban shelter where the homeless population actually resides and has access to necessary services.
All of this suggests that legislative policies aimed strictly at forcing these vacant homes back onto the market are fundamentally insufficient to solve the underlying affordability crisis in high-demand areas.
The evidence strongly supports that conclusion. Cities like Vancouver, Oakland, and even Paris in France have experimented with vacancy taxes. And while they can push a small handful of units back onto the market, the overall supply increase is marginal. An analysis of the French vacancy tax found that the total supply increase amounted to less than 1% of the existing stock. The impact is just negligible against the structural shortage created by decades of restrictive zoning.
So, to synthesize this part, the core economic reality is that high vacancies exist in remote or deteriorating areas where housing isn't needed. Meanwhile, the severe low-vacancy, high-cost crisis exists in high-demand metros where the employment and services are. The vacant homes are simply in the wrong place, the wrong condition, or are already serving a necessary market function.
Exactly.
As we transition here, we need to move from the purely economic to the historical. We have to consider the context of property concentration across the arc of history, because the trends we are seeing today have distinct and deeply worrying echoes from the decline of powerful historical societies.
This is where the concept of neo-feudalism becomes highly relevant. It's a term that is increasingly entering mainstream political and economic discourse, and it speaks directly to what happens when wealth accumulation becomes inextricably linked to controlling shelter.
So what exactly defines this modern term neo-feudalism beyond just sounding, provocative?
Well, neo-feudalism describes a new social and economic order where class mobility is increasingly restricted and property ownership is heavily concentrated. It defines the relationship between renters, who are sort of the modern serfs, and the monolithic structures, whether they are private equity funds or that decentralized micro-investor ecosystem we talked about that profit massively from their living conditions. It mirrors European feudalism, where lords controlled vast tracts of land and the majority of the population were propertyless serfs who maintained those estates in exchange for meager protection and subsistence.
But the control mechanisms today are much more sophisticated than a medieval lord standing over his field. How does this control manifest economically today?
Today, the control is digitized and systematized. We see the use of algorithmic rent pricing, which ensures that landlords maximize yield simultaneously across an entire metro area. It eliminates genuine price competition. We see the use of technology for predictive and rapid eviction processes. The modern serf doesn't necessarily work the land, but they are subject to a high degree of economic control and surveillance by distant, automated owners. And crucially, they completely lack the equity-building opportunity that historically provided stability.
And the data on ownership decline really supports this shift toward a modern form of serfdom where wealth is just concentrated at the very top.
Absolutely. The erosion of the middle class is directly tied to the collapse of homeownership. particularly among young families. Homeownership among millennials, so ages 25 to 34, has plunged to just 37%. You contrast that with Generation X, who enjoyed a 45.4% rate at the same age. When you lose that stake in the ground, you lose your primary economic engine.
Historically, dispersed property ownership was seen as the fundamental pillar, the secret sauce, for liberal capitalism and upward mobility. It sustained the middle and working classes by giving them a literal stake in the system.
That's the crucial social contract that is being dismantled. Homeowners currently have 4 times the net wealth of non-homeowners. And homeownership has historically been the primary driver of multi-generational wealth accumulation in America. When that pathway is systematically closed off due to investor competition and rising barriers to entry, inequality widens exponentially. Economists like Thomas Piketty have demonstrated how asset prices, especially real estate, inflate global inequality. He showed that the proportion of real estate wealth held by the middle and working classes has fallen substantially in many developed nations, while the wealthy share just continues to grow. Housing stops being shelter and becomes a global hedge fund.
And if we look backward, the patterns of land concentration throughout history offer a really chilling prediction. The rise of the Roman latifundia system is often cited as a direct mechanism of that empire's eventual social collapse.
The Roman parallel is incredibly precise and instructive. Rome gorged itself on latifundia, which translates to broad estates. These were massive, consolidated agricultural estates, often maintained by slave labor. The economic mechanism that fueled this shift in the 2nd century BCE was straightforward: the Long Punic Wars.
Specifically, the Second Punic War, which lasted 17 years and demanded long-term military service from small farmers.
Exactly. When these citizen soldiers returned home, their small family farms were neglected, destroyed by conflict, or debt-burdened. They simply couldn't compete economically with the large estates owned by wealthy Roman elites who relied on vast numbers of enslaved people captured in the wars. So these returning soldiers were forced to sell their land. The wealthy, who had concentrated capital, were perfectly positioned to buy up these small, distressed plots and consolidate them into these massive latifundia.
And this consolidation just accelerated, creating a major crisis for the Republic.
It created a dual crisis. An economic crisis because the elite were displacing citizen farmers, and a military crisis because the Roman army relied on property owners for enlistment. Pliny the Elder, writing decades later, famously argued that the latifundia had ruined Italy and would eventually ruin the Roman provinces as well. He cited the extraordinary concentration where, at one point, just 6 owners possessed half the entire province of Africa.
Wow. 6 owners. That level of concentration led directly to political and social turmoil in the capital, demanding radical action.
It did. The landless peasantry, unable to farm and displaced from their generational homes, moved en masse to the city of Rome. They became the urban poor, dependent on state subsidies, the famous bread and circuses. The resulting social tensions culminated in the political violence surrounding the efforts of the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius. They attempted land redistribution reform by proposing an agrarian law that would limit the amount of public land any one individual could possess, mandate the state acquire excess land, and then redistribute it in small allotments to the landless poor.
And the political elite reacted violently to this attempt to dilute their consolidated power.
Precisely. This resistance to land redistribution reform led to the assassinations of both brothers, marking the first time political bloodshed was used against elected officials in the Republic's history. It demonstrated that land concentration undermines the very foundations of political stability, often culminating in violence when reform is attempted.
And this pattern, this structural design for concentrated ownership, wasn't confined to Rome.
Not at all. Centuries later, during the Spanish colonial expansion, you had the encomienda and hacienda systems in Latin America, particularly in Mexico and Peru. These were essentially structural forms designed to extract resources and enforce power dynamics across vast territories. These systems shaped the landscape with massive centralized land holdings, managed for the benefit of distant owners and the Spanish crown, often relying on forced indigenous labor. The core intent concentrated ownership for extraction replicated the dynamics that defined the Roman decline.
So the modern warning is that land concentration, whether it's implemented by Roman elites, colonial lords, or today's institutional and decentralized investors, consistently precedes periods of profound social unrest and systemic instability. We saw it in pre-revolutionary France, Tsarist Russia, and the political violence of the Gracchi era.
And the modern manifestation is the culmination of financial behavior and flawed planning policy. You have investors controlling 1/5 of single-family homes, combined with these anti-sprawl policies implemented since the 1970s. These policies intentionally restrict housing development on the periphery to boost the land value inside urban cores. This regulatory landscape produces extraordinary unearned price premiums, upwards of 100% to 150% above construction costs in major coastal markets like San Francisco and LA. The land concentration, combined with an artificial scarcity created by regulation, has made housing an unreachable asset for a growing majority, forcing them into a precarious rented existence.
Which brings us to the foundational element that ties everything together: why the market cannot absorb this financial pressure. Academics consistently identify one factor as the single most critical driver of the affordability crisis and resulting homelessness rates: the lack of adequate housing supply.
This is the critical connection point. The academic consensus is now overwhelming. Housing costs are the single largest driver of homelessness. It explains far more variation in rates across different cities than individual vulnerabilities like substance use disorder, mental health, or employment conditions. While those vulnerabilities clearly influence who becomes homeless, it's the housing costs that determine the overall rate of homelessness in any given area.
And we can see this relationship clearly when you compare city data. In urban areas where homelessness rose sharply, places like Austin, Sacramento, and Tucson, it's not a coincidence that their rents increased faster than the national average.
Conversely, urban areas that saw stability or even managed slight declines in homelessness, places like Chicago, Houston, and Philadelphia, recorded slower growth in rents. The math is brutal, but simple. Homelessness increases exponentially when rents rise by amounts that low-income households cannot absorb. When half of all renters nationwide are spending at least 30% of their income on rent and a quarter are spending 50% or more, you have built a massive, fragile vulnerability into the financial lives of millions of households.
This issue is frequently described colloquially as a housing shortage, but economically that term kind of obscures the mechanical problem at play.
Indeed. We're using shortage in the everyday sense. But in a well-functioning market, the price of housing should eventually trend toward the marginal cost of construction, the cost of building the actual physical structure. However, in our hottest housing markets, due to restrictive local zoning, bureaucratic height limits, and complex regulatory hurdles, the supply is extremely inelastic. So when demand increases, due to population growth, investment, or migration, it translates almost entirely into higher prices rather than new housing units being built quickly enough to meet the demand. This is why you see those extraordinary price premiums we mentioned earlier.
How large is the scale of these regulatory restrictions? We often hear about them, but it's hard to grasp the true magnitude of the artificial scarcity being created.
The scale is staggering. Estimates suggest that without existing supply constraints and zoning restrictions, LA County alone could see a massive 44% increase in its overall housing supply. The bottleneck isn't material costs or construction capacity, it is regulatory policy. This includes zoning laws that prevent multifamily housing in huge swaths of the city, restrictive floor area ratios that limit the building size, mandatory parking minimums that dramatically increase construction costs, and complicated, unpredictable review processes that add years and millions of dollars to development timelines.
Let's look at a city that actually tried to implement meaningful reform, like Minneapolis. They eliminated single-family zoning, which sounds like the ultimate win for supply, but the outcome was underwhelming. Why did it fall short?
The Minneapolis example is a crucial illustration of why removing one restriction is often insufficient against a mountain of others. While they eliminated single-family zoning, theoretically allowing duplexes or triplexes to be built where only detached homes existed, the rest of the regulatory landscape made it difficult or financially impossible. For instance, builders were still constrained by rules requiring that a new duplex or triplex fit into roughly the same footprint as the previous single-family home. More importantly, they still had to adhere to highly restrictive floor area ratios and demanding parking minimums.
So even though you could theoretically build 3 units, the required parking spots, the limits on how much square footage you could build on the lot, and the expense of navigating those rules meant the project was economically infeasible. Why build a complex triplex when you could simply renovate a single-family home for less regulatory headache?
Precisely. It proves that you cannot have a silver bullet reform. You need to systematically dismantle the convoluted cluster of rules, the cumulative effect of decades of local control, to genuinely create supply elasticity. If the local rules make it unprofitable or too complex to build anything other than single-family homes, developers will continue to build only those or nothing at all.
Therefore, the core solution has to be building new supply, not just relying on converting the limited number of vacant properties. And the contract between supply-starved markets and those with more flexible building environments is profound.
The data contrasting LA or San Francisco with Houston is perhaps the most powerful evidence available. Houston, famously, has a much more flexible, market-driven, and less regulated zoning environment. They've grown their housing stock relative to their population consistently. The result: Houston has a homelessness rate 19 times lower than San Francisco. That difference, 19 times, is not a rounding error due to differing weather patterns or social services. It is fundamentally a reflection of housing supply and price. Population growth generally does not explain growth in homelessness, except in instances where there is an insufficient increase in the housing supply.
And we saw how the failure to build new housing stock directly undermined federal efforts to address the crisis in restricted markets.
Yes. The data on federal housing vouchers is a heartbreaking example of a great program failing against market scarcity. In a supply-starved city like LA, 94% of federal housing vouchers intended for permanent homeless placement went tragically unused. Why? Because landlords, in a market where they might face 100 applicants per vacancy, have absolutely no financial incentive to accept the vouchers, which often involve bureaucratic hoops and lower payment ceilings. The market is too tight. The financial motivation is absent.
But the exact same program saw massive success in a high-supply area.
It was an unmitigated success in Houston. The same Housing First programs, relying on the same federal vouchers, successfully transitioned 25,000 people off the streets precisely because the market had slack. Landlords, facing less competition for tenants, were incentivized to accept the vouchers and participate in the program. This confirms the recommendation from nearly all major research bodies. Allowing more housing, subsidized or not, to be built in high-demand areas keeps costs down and reduces homelessness dramatically.
So, whether you view the crisis through the lens of displacement by investors or the challenge of homelessness, the ultimate bottleneck is the same: the local policies that prevent us from building enough places to live at scale. The recommendation, therefore, is to focus on welcoming a diversity of low-cost housing options.
Absolutely. The recommendation centers on units that are currently illegal or extremely difficult to build, such as apartments or individual rooms with shared facilities. A type of housing, often called single-room occupancy, or SRO, that was affordable and common before modern restrictive zoning systematically prevented its development. This returns the housing market closer to equilibrium, which benefits everyone, especially the low-income households most susceptible to that initial displacement. It is clear that while we might all aspire to single-family homeownership, the policy priority must be to create diverse, affordable housing units of all types to stabilize the market and provide a basic safety net against this investor frenzy.
So this deep dive has revealed two fundamental and deeply interconnected problems that are fueling our current crisis. First, the modern paradox is driven by this decentralized body of small investors who are successfully and rapidly depleting the stock of affordable starter homes, essentially pulling the ladder up on the middle class. Second, the reason this causes a systemic crisis, rather than just a market fluctuation, is the structural inelasticity of housing supply, driven by decades of restrictive local regulations, which means we cannot build our way out of the crisis, and we definitely can't rely on those 15 million vacant vacation homes in remote areas to solve the problem.
And if we connect this final analysis back to history and the concept of neo-feudalism, the trajectory is genuinely alarming. History provides a consistent warning. When property and power concentrate in the hands of a small elite, when the majority loses its stake in the land and becomes dependent on centralized owners for shelter, the society risks becoming economically stagnant and politically unstable. We are witnessing a great reversion toward a feudal reality, fueled by policy choices that intentionally restrict supply and financial incentives that encourage housing to be treated purely as a speculative commodity, rather than a necessary foundation for human dignity and democratic stability. The ability of the individual to own a piece of the future is fundamental to the stability of the entire society.